Hello, everyone, and good morning. My name is Kaden Hawkins, and I am a rising sophomore here at the University of Michigan. Thank you all for joining us today. Whether you are on campus in Ann Arbor or Ypsilanti, elsewhere in Michigan or in the United States, we want to recognize that we are all living and learning on stolen indigenous territories, many of which were toiled over by Black enslaved peoples, specifically the Anishinaabe peoples formed and stewarded the land and traditional territories where the University of Michigan is located. This includes the Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, along with their neighbors, the Seneca, Delaware, Shawnee, and Wyandot nations. We acknowledge and thank those Native peoples who still struggle for self-determination. The fights against shelter colonialism and anti-Blackness will always be inextricably linked. To the land, to the collective, and to the ancestors, we thank you, we thank you, we thank you.
How did I do that? Good morning, everyone. One more again. Good morning, everyone. It's a beautiful day and a beautiful occasion to be here. Greetings and welcome to the third annual Juneteenth Symposium at the University of Michigan. I'm Tabby Chavis, Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer, and a Professor of Psychology and Education here at the university. I am honored to be with you today and to thank you for your participation in the university's commemoration of Juneteenth. This year's symposium features a fantastic combination of scholars, practitioners, community members, students, and just change makers. It's a really great lineup, so please join me in congratulating and really thanking our planning team, especially Gloria Taylor and Rachel Dawson, who served as co-chairs for this year's commemoration. As we all know, relatively recently recognized as a national holiday since 2021, Juneteenth, also known as Freedom Day, Jubilee Day, Liberation Day, and Emancipation Day, is a holiday celebrating the emancipation of those who have been enslaved in the United States. Originating in Galveston, Texas, this day marks the anniversary date of June 19, 1865, and the announcement by Union Army General Gordon Granger proclaiming freedom from slavery in Texas. This day has grown significantly since then and is now celebrated annually on June 19th throughout the United States. Before it became a federal holiday, it has been long celebrated by many Black communities in intimate and celebratory ways, and this recent federal recognition marks what so many have been celebrating and recognizing and fighting to make sure it's not forgotten for so long. Although Juneteenth acknowledges the end of slavery, it is also important to remember the conditions following that reflect the legacy of slavery, such as Jim Crow laws, segregation, the denial of civil rights, and how they continue to impact our society to this day. For centuries, African Americans in our nation have spent time, effort, energy dealing with physical, mental, and emotional trauma of systemic racism, which is why this year's symposium theme, Systems Check, Exploring Structural Solutions to Systemic Racism, is so important. While our community has a history and a legacy of joy and resilience in the context of this struggle and in the face of this trauma, the answer cannot be on the backs of the community. The answer must be related to changing systems and structures and processes that continue to impact our communities and actually undermine the health of our whole society. During the next 2 days, we will take an in-depth look at the impact of systemic racism and plausible solutions in the areas of fair housing, fighting voter suppression, and expanding educational access. And we will explore, with the guidance of numerous experts and champions, how to develop and implement policy to create a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive society. The discussions and the work that will happen during the symposium are timely and of particular significance and importance now more than ever, given our current sociopolitical context. We probably have all heard by now that state legislatures, 20 and counting across our country, have taken aim and attack at diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and specifically work that addresses race and in ways that reinforce anti-Blackness. For example, states are actively legislating policies to eliminate diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and suppressing free speech and academic freedom by determining what may or may not be taught or discussed in the classroom, banning books, and the like. Many of you all have also been following the debates around African American history specifically, including attempts to erase it. And this erasure attempts are based on the arguments that teaching our history in America is indoctrination or that it lacks educational value. As a scholar who's devoted my career to the positive identity development and resilience of Black adolescents, achievement motivation among students of color, and the ways that campus and educational racial environments impact students academically and socially, I unfortunately have had firsthand experiences in engaging with individuals and the broader societal political forces that seek to suppress our light and to make us question our work, its value, and its excellence. But I also feel encouraged by our collective spirit and our dedication to making our campuses, our neighborhoods, our communities, and our institutions in the society more diverse, more equitable, more inclusive, and more just. I've recently had opportunities to participate in a variety of national conversations and convenings with fellow chief diversity officers, and I'm looking forward to the panel discussion this morning with my colleagues from Michigan State University and Central Michigan University to talk more about the challenges, attacks, and implications for our work, particularly when we are also anticipating a decision in the Supreme Court around the future of affirmative action in higher education, which could literally happen any minute now. And what I believe is important to say from this stage as host of this event is that regardless of what's happening nationally, here at the University of Michigan, we're not backing down in our DEI commitment, and in fact, we're accelerating our work with more creativity and energy. And I know I share this commitment with my panel colleagues and their institutions and with this community. I also find myself thinking a great deal about our colleagues across the country in those states where they're now being required to eliminate or alter their diversity, equity, and inclusion focused work or look for new jobs. I am proud that many of these colleagues are resisting this attempted erasure in overt and subversive ways. It's not surprising. This is the history of our work. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that doing the just thing is the most challenging thing and can come at cost. But I'm sure my fellow chief diversity officers can agree that we don't believe in easy, because the issues we're called to work on are not easy, and because we don't believe that our role is to wait in the wings, to wait for what happens next. We must be leaders, problem solvers, collaborators, co-conspirators, and justice advocates. So as a community, we will forge ahead. We must remain united in our collective mission, and we must seize this moment and write our next chapter and not let others write the narrative for us. With that preaching aside, I hope you're all ready as I aim for what I know will be an excellent symposium. In addition to our fantastic panel discussions, our 2023 closing keynote address will feature Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr., who is the James S. McConnell Distinguished University Professor and Chair in the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University, an outspoken public scholar on Black experiences in all their richness and diversity. The symposium will culminate in a film festival at the State Street Theater and Juneteenth activities at the Kids Zone tent, part of the Ann Arbor Top of the Park annual celebration. So please take advantage of as many of these activities as you can. And before I conclude, please join me in thanking the Office of Multicultural Initiatives and the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for all of their efforts in putting together this year's symposium. Thank you. On behalf of our entire community, I would also like to welcome all of you who have been able to join us both here in person and also those who are joining us virtually. At this time, I would like to welcome Regina Sims to the stage to sing Lift Every Voice and Sing.
Good morning, everyone. I am delighted and honored to be here this morning participating in the kickoff festivities for U of M's third annual Juneteenth Symposium. I thank you for the invitation, and I would like to convey a special thanks to all the organizations that were involved in the planning of this event. Let's lift our voice and sing. Till earth and heaven ring with the harmony of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of faith that the darkness has taught. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us, facing the rising sun of a new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. We go on, we strive, the chase wide, felt in the days when hope unborn had died, yet with us steady beat, and now our weary feet come to the place for which our Father sighed. We have come over a way that seems has been watered. We have come straight out of love. Of the gloomy past, till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star is cast. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by led us into the light, keep us forever in the path we pray. Blessed our feet, straight from the great face our God, where we rest thee. Blessed
our hearts from when the wine of the world before. Yes, be shadow beneath thy hand. May we forever stand true to our God, true to our native land.
Good morning. I thought Dr. Chavis woke us up this morning. Clearly not. Good morning. Thank you. Good morning to everybody, both here in the physical space, but to the folks also in the virtual space as well. Welcome to the open plenary for this year's Juneteenth celebration. I am Edmund Graham. I currently serve as the Associate Director for the National Center for Institutional Diversity. And on behalf of the Juneteenth Planning Committee, I would like to share my thanks to you all for your support of the symposium and for being in community with us here this morning and over the next 2 days. I would also like to express a special thanks to Provost McCauley and Vice Provost and Chief Diversity Officer Tabby Chavis, as leadership support and engagement are critical in achieving material change. And so we are thankful that you find value and thus support and embrace Juneteenth celebrations and traditions here on the campus. Next, I would like to thank our incredible sponsors from across the campus for their contributions towards bringing the committee's vision to light for this year's Juneteenth Symposium. So with that, I would like to thank the University of Michigan Women of Color Task Force, the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, the UN Precision Health, the Department of African American and African Studies, the Michigan Medicine Office of Health, Equity, and Inclusion, the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy, the Michigan Institute for Clinical and Health Research, the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts, and lastly, the Rackham Graduate School. And with that out of the way, I'm the type of person that in order for me to connect, I have to tell a story. I try not to steal a lie, but that's just how I make the connection. And so in this moment, I reflect on my earliest introduction and exposure to Juneteenth. I remember as a kid in the 1900s, as my oldest daughter would say, my mother had a Juneteenth shirt. And I was about 6, 7, 8 years old or somewhere in there. And she would primarily wear it in the month of June and early into July. And of course, whenever we would go out, inevitably someone would ask her, "What is Juneteenth?" And it seemed as if she wore that shirt just so she'd get the opportunity to kind of school folks about Black history. And so folks can get a sense of like the social and historical context of the founding and development of this country. And though she was not an academic, as I think of it now, it may have been one of my earliest memories of public and community engaged scholarship. Then I didn't have the language or even the understanding of what she was doing. And maybe she didn't either, but what I know now is that she was engaging in a form of counter-narrative storytelling, which, of course, is a core element of many critical theories, including critical race theory. She would gracefully share the history of Juneteenth and its importance to her and the significance to others. And I, along with my sisters, got to witness this. Part of the reason why I share this is because I think our ability to reflect on the past provides great clarity for how we move in both the present and in the future. And in thinking about the moment that we're in now, the social political climate and the challenges against the value of diversity and higher education and abroad today, I find the theme of this year's celebration, Systems Check, exploring structural solutions to systemic racism, to be apt, as there are parallels between the origins of why we celebrate the Juneteenth holiday, those origins being the emancipation of enslaved folks and the system of keeping them uninformed for nearly 2.5 years. So being mindful of those folks in Texas who were later informed. And parallel that to the current systematic efforts to reject DEI, as Dr. Chavis pointed out earlier, and roll back progress that has been made through the implementation of DEI principles as a means of inculcating and sustaining ideological rhetoric. The celebration of Juneteenth is important for a number of reasons. Of course, we don't have enough time to share those here today, but I'll sort of reflect on some now. I think it serves as a reminder to critically assess the past and actively challenge revisionist perspectives that contribute to or exacerbate contemporary social inequities. It's also a reminder that there will be concerted efforts to maintain the status quo. However, collaborative and persistent effort, much like those Union soldiers that made their way west to inform enslaved folks of their emancipation, will lead us to where we want to go, a more just and equitable society, reflected in the policies and practices of all our social institutions, including education and higher education, where we're all located. Lastly, it serves as a reminder that you can't systematically dampen joy, as I learned seeing the joy in my mother's face when she would tell folks about Juneteenth. Now, with that, I have the esteemed pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's panel discussion, Sloan Campbell. Sloan is a California native and a rising senior here at the University of Michigan, and she's doing all of the things. So she's double majoring in Spanish and communication and media with a minor in global media studies. Sloan is an active student and is chair of the University of Michigan's Black Student Union Executive Board and will be moderating our panel discussion here this afternoon. So please join me in welcoming Sloan Campbell to the podium.
Hi, y'all. I'm Sloan Campbell. I'm just going to jump right into it. So can I invite the panelists up, Dr. Jabbar Bennett, Dr. Tavi Chavez, and Dr. Shauna Patterson-Stevens? Talk about Juneteenth given this current social-political context. For example, national attacks on DEI and African American studies, and a new surge in voter suppression laws. So as you each individually introduce yourselves, I would like to invite you to offer a few thoughts on why gatherings like this are particularly important at this moment.
Good morning, everyone. So my name is Jabbar Bennett, and as you heard earlier, I serve as Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer at Michigan State University. It is really an honor to be here to help celebrate your third annual Juneteenth commemorative celebration. We're hosting ours tomorrow. So I'm just glad this is something that all of our institutions value and appreciate. So it's really important to not only acknowledge Juneteenth, but to celebrate it. The acknowledgement goes to, I think, taking a step toward addressing a very dark past and part of our history, chattel slavery, the social construct of racism, or race rather, I should say, that led to racism we're still experiencing. But unless we talk about these histories and these experiences, which are part of American history, it's not just history about Black folks or African Americans in this country, then we can't repeat some of the same wrongs that we've unfortunately seen in the past. So I think it's important to acknowledge the circumstances of many folks in our society, as well as their ancestors, but the ways that these wrongs have been perpetuated in different forms that I'm sure we'll talk about as we get into it.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Shauna Patterson-Stevens, she, her, hers, Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer at Central Michigan University. I agree. I feel like moments like this allows us to reflect upon the fact that all of this is cyclical. We have seen these movements before. We've seen regression. We've seen moments of resistance. And it's not anything new to our history. And so I do think that it is a tapping into what has occurred in the past, a reminder that what we're experiencing today is just a new iteration of what we've experienced in the past. And thinking about the ways that we've overcome some of the issues that we've encountered in the past, from chattel slavery through the disenfranchisement of folks that are queer, differently abled, women's rights, like all those things are connected and intertwined. And so I think moments like this help us to reflect upon how we were successful in the past and how we need to think differently, more critically on the ways to address tomorrow's challenges today.
Echoing what both my colleagues have said, and I guess the thing that I would add about celebrations like this, both at a university or kind of public level, as well as the ongoing celebrations that Black communities have been doing for many, many decades, is the value of making sure that history is, again, not erased and that is passed on with developing youth. I will say a big piece of my research and scholarship that I occasionally get to do now is one of the major findings from my work on Black youth identity is that Black youth who feel a connection and understanding of their heritage actually have a more affirmed sense of identity, but it also engenders motivation because it allows people to see possibility, to understand the accomplishments of not only those that are approximately around them, but those who preceded them in ways that allow for resilience and thriving in the face of challenge. And so attempts to, having celebrations like this in the context of attempted erasure feels even more important. The other piece of that, which relates to the celebration and the participation of so many community members, when I've worked with educational spaces, we've also found that the more that education spaces, teachers, counselors, practitioners understood the history of Black communities, the better able that they were to actually understand both how race matters in the lives of their students, but to also better see our Black students as individuals and full humans. And so celebrations like this really remind us that it's not just the right thing to do to engage this history, but it's critical to the thriving, the resilience, and the health of our youth, but also the systems that serve and support them.
So before we dive a little bit deeper, the title of this panel is Systems Check, Exploring Structural Solutions to Systemic Racism. And it is important to clarify what do we mean by using the word systems, simply to make sure we are all on the same page. So if any or all of you would like to answer that one.
Well, systems theory would suggest that we're thinking about one's social location in proximity to power. And so when we're thinking about different types of systems that have enveloped the US infrastructure and have sustained centuries of inequality and disenfranchisement. We're thinking about those very structures that have maintained those modems of control and power and privilege. And we think about how we are situated within those mechanisms to shape our lived experience, our material lived experience. So we think about racism, for example, and we, I think, understand at this point that it is made up, right? Like, it is made up, it's socially constructed, we have made this thing up, but it's very real. Racism has a real impact on the lived experience of minoritized folks and majoritized folks. And you think about the psychological impact of racism on everyone in this room, it actually does matter, even though it's made up. And so we think about how all of that comes together in structures, in US infrastructures such as the economic system, the criminal justice system, higher education. They are all connected, they are all embedded, and it's all about the ways that our social identities come together in the nexus of ourselves and interact with those spaces. That's my understanding of what we're talking about.
Anybody else want to answer? Or?
And again, echoing my colleague, but I think the systems approach is, I mean, when we think about the history of any successful social movement, it has been about changing systems and structures, policies, practices, norms that circumscribe the life chances of individuals within those spaces. And it's really important, I think, to name systems and resist what is often the attractive focusing on individuals' view. Good and bad people who are engaging in racism and the like too, that we know from the work in organizational spaces and our lived experience work that you can place good people into a system with structures and norms that are set up to exclude and marginalize, and those good people will be a part of perpetuating that inequality. And by taking it away from good or badness, then it becomes not just an individual decision, but a set of historical and long-standing and deep-seated structural norms that, again, live with and beyond any single individual within that space. Educational systems are great examples of spaces that culturally look similar for long periods of time and resist change, even though the people who are in them transition over and over again. So the systems approach really is about, getting beyond the individual, getting beyond what is also an attractive approach, focusing on, let's just change people's hearts and minds. And then we will be, engaging in less racist practice and the like too. Again, if you look at history, any successful social movement did not, if you look at the civil rights movement, then there was not the strategy to, let's wait until everyone decides that racism is bad in order to move forward. There's revisionist history, which is why events like this are so important. People are invoking, Dr. King would have not liked for us to call out racism because he cared about character, when in fact, when he was assassinated, he was one of the most unpopular people in the United States. So because of his push for systemic and structural change. The other piece of that I focus on, because often our interventions focus on individuals, implicit bias trainings are terrific tools and structures for lots of reasons, but if we don't couple that with the knowledge that it's not just you as an individual, that those biases derive from socialization that you've received from structures, communities, families, then therefore the solution is to change those structures and contexts, then we will be repeating the cycle over and over again. So, Jabbar, you want to?
Sure, and I just wanted to mention, as my colleagues have said, the ways to address these challenges, these systemic challenges, especially within our organizations, it's a multi-pronged approach. So having policies that really help to address issues of equity or inequity in the way that they are structured is really important. Thinking about education and training, as we've heard before, anti-racist training. We have at MSU sort of adopted a practice and an approach that Michigan uses in sort of engaged dialogue, sustained dialogue. So just bringing people together to talk about difference, to understand what their privilege means, because we all have some type of it, whether we don't feel like it all the time or not, but bringing people together to understand what their identity means in different spaces and how that impacts the overall system. When I talk about policies too, one of the really important areas to think about is in our hiring, in our promotion, in our recruitment, whether we're talking about faculty and staff, whether we're talking about students. So thinking about ways that we can address inequities in how we are posting job positions, how we are putting search committees together, the type of education and training and awareness raising that they are receiving is really important as well. And then checks along the way at different points of the hiring process, for example. But there's a lot we can do, but there are many approaches that we have to take because the system is large, the system is real. So we have to acknowledge that too.
Thank you. So you touched on my next question a little bit, but as institutions such as MSU, CMU, or UM are in themselves systems and structures with norms, but also a part of a larger system, why would we address this? And you said for MSU a couple of examples of how you choose to implement on your campus, but for CMU and UM, Could you provide some examples in some ways in which your teams are trying to address the systemic racism on campus?
I think in addition to some of the things that Dr. Bennett was talking about, considering the A to Z of hiring, for example, and taking a look at our data to make sure that we're being effective. Some of the other things we're looking at are our policies that are most detrimental to our vulnerable populations at CMU. So one example would be, what's the demographic of most people sent to collections? What's the demographic of most people sent through the conduct process? When we're finding people responsible for sexual harassment and assault, what's the demographic? Because I think when you line all those things up, you'll start to get a bigger picture of how all of our policies and practices are coming together to either benefit or be exclusionary, and maybe even target certain populations. Now, if we're finding that, generally speaking, there's no significance in any of those analyses, then you're probably in a good place, because then that means that, generally speaking, your policy for sending folks to collections is one that offers some parity. But I'm pretty sure that when you line all those things up, you're not gonna find the picture that you wanna see. You're gonna find that you are disproportionately sending certain folks to collections, maybe folks that most need financial assistance and aid, maybe folks that most need support that would ensure that they have all of their basic needs met, so they're not being sent to collections in the first place. And so when we think about some of the things that we're considering at Central Michigan University, we're considering the fact that, yes, we have a responsibility to any of our students, all of our students, but we are uniquely situated in a very rural space. How are we therefore considering our proximity to our environment, and how are we thinking about our responsibility in uplifting the most vulnerable populations? And that's some of the things that we've been looking at CMU.
Thank you. I think a couple of examples that I'll share relates to the challenges that we're facing with locally and nationally around our student enrollments, and really thinking about the racialized barriers that inhibit achieving the kind of abundant representation of all communities that we want on our campus. Particular in our diversity, equity, and inclusion strategic planning work, we showed lots of progress. In fact, among our broader population of underrepresented students, but our progress was slower and smaller for our Black and Native American students. And so looking at the aggregate's important, but also making sure that we're using data and that we're disaggregating data by looking within the student of color community, being able to then look at specific histories and conditions and structures that have uniquely impacted the access of our Black student community, both in the state of Michigan and nationally, as well as our Native American and tribal communities, again, in the state of Michigan and nationally. And so moving towards solutions that then allow us to both care about and work toward the good and service of all students, but doing so in a way that we have to name and act on the specific conditions that are impacting different communities. An example of one structure has been to work in partnership with local schools that serve that are underserved and that serve our communities. We have a program called Wolverine Pathways that partners with schools and students and their families, starting with youth in the 7th grade, providing supplemental educational supports for students, engaging their parents as partners instead of assuming that families, Black families and Native American families don't care about education, which is a trope and a narrative that comes into play. And also providing supports and capacity building for those schools so that the impacts go to the students who are in the program, but also extend beyond those students to providing something that provides a resource for under-resourced and overtaxed teachers and systems there too. So structures that work on supporting students so that they end up here at the University of Michigan, but also supporting more positive relationships with communities so that they see Michigan as a place that is for their children, for their youth, and also to, as a public university, provide tangible instrumental resources to schools and school systems that are unequal because of the ways that structures are set up to fund public education. Another example that I'll share that we're really excited about, and when Provost Macaulay joins us later in the celebration, I really want to give credit to her as well, is also the incentive structures that we put into place for leadership. So if we, as we're assessing leaders and their performance, as we're considering hiring, if we're not including attention to these issues as part of the metrics of high performance, then people that we hire don't feel compelled to, unless they happen to want to, then they're not going to act toward them. My goal is that it really doesn't matter what you want to do, that if we're signaling that attention to an inclusive environment is a part of being an excellent leader, then making sure that that is a part of both the hiring criteria, what have you done, not just your values, but what have you done from a skills and a leadership perspective, and then building that into assessments of performance and excellence for those leaders. As a real example, I would just say this is my first year in the Chief Diversity Officer role at U of M, even though I've been a faculty here for a couple of decades. We instituted a process when working with search firms that hired central leaders, such as deans and institute leaders. And we instituted a practice of the provost and I meeting with the search firms and the search committees to talk about, the values that we have around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to ask them about their practices. Are you prospecting prospective leaders in a real and authentic way? Or are you looking for people to fill your list for diversity, but not engaging with them as if they're authentic candidates? If you come to us and you send us a list of people that are not diverse, we're going to turn it back. And ask you to search again, because we actually know that there's talent out there that you probably haven't accessed. In fact, we know you haven't. And I will say this year, somebody tried it. And we got a slate of candidates for a field that were, all white men. And we, said, hey, sorry, this is not going to work. You have to go back and do more work, and you don't get extra pay for it. So it really was an example of saying, the baseline for you doing your job excellently means that you are integrating these things, and if you don't, that will be a part of how you are supported, rewarded, and evaluated. And that's at the highest leadership level, but it also needs to happen, when we're thinking about supervisors and chairs and also other members of teams and how they contribute.
Thank you. And as this panel is directed towards Juneteenth, it would be a true fault within our system, this system, to not specifically address the efforts made within these initiatives such as policy reform or data collection or hiring of leadership, to not focus on the struggles of Black students and people surrounding. So what are ways in which within these initiatives that you guys are implementing, you guys explicitly combat anti-Blackness and the well-being of your Black students, staff, and faculty on campus?
Great question. So I work really closely with our Student Life and Engagement Division, in which there is an Assistant Vice President for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging. And what we do, we work very closely with our student groups, our Black Student Alliance, our Black Graduate Student Alliance, and others, or the Black Graduate Student Association, to ensure that we're in close contact and that we are accessible and that we provide support and direct communication with those students. We also have a very active Black Alumni Association at Michigan State, and that group holds us accountable as well. They write to us, they request data, we provide it, we meet, we talk through it, and we also talk about the ways in which the MSU Black alumni, and I'm pointing at Shauna because she's one of them, how we can partner to support our students. And it's not just through resources that are financial, but it's through mentoring and it's through advising as well. So paying attention to our Black students, listening to them, I invite students to serve on institution-wide committees that my office puts forward. They may not be Black students, but they may be students of what we call this coalition of racial and ethnic minority students. So we support student groups. We support coalitions of underrepresented students. We support progressive students and their issues. And I just want to say, too, because Shauna called it out, the queer population we cannot forget about, and we must acknowledge that we have queer folks in the Black population, too. So thinking about and acknowledging intersectionality, not just us and our teams, but helping our colleagues on campus understand as well. So for me, it's about access, it's about open communication, it's about support. And it's also about Black students knowing where they can go and who they can turn to when there's an issue. There may be an anonymous bias reporting system, but they also know there are faculty and staff, people like me who they can also reach out to. So that helps to make a difference.
Agreed. Go green. I had to do it one good time. I have to go home, okay? I have to be able to get to my house. So in addition, I think it's great to be able to inculcate the experiences of our students in everything that we do. Our students are very smart, and they're begging for us to catch up to them, like begging. We are so far behind just because of the ways that institutions move. It's purposeful, it's planful, we understand that. So in addition to making sure that we're considering the lived experiences of our current students, our past students, our community members, faculty, and staff, I've been leaning into the National Association for Diversity Officers in Higher Education's anti-racism framework. It's really awesome because it has a 10-point program to ensure that you're thinking about anti-racism, which includes anti-Blackness, right? In the work of admissions, in the work of recruitment and selection, in the work of ensuring that you are attending to the basic needs of your students in student affairs, right? And then the broader needs of your students in academic affairs. So some of the things that we've been looking at is ensuring that our students don't feel that it's their responsibility to do the work of the institution by way of their student organizations. I do have a presidential student advisory network, for example, where we're asking students to call us to task, and then we pick up the load. And we find different ways across our units to make sure that we are truly actualizing what they're asking for. An example would be students were needing additional space. This is not news, right? Like, students need space. We are diversifying our student populations, and we need to think about the structural diversity of all of our institutions. At Central Michigan University, a lot of our students have to go off campus to have a good time, you know? Well-rounded students is what we're looking for, but they were often being targeted by the police, our minoritized students in particular. And it was usually by local residents within Mount Pleasant calling the police. So we found more space on campus because it just made sense. Like, you need to become involved and engaged with community development and community building. We brought you here. It's our responsibility to make sure you're seen and heard. It's our responsibility to make sure that we are attending to all of the needs that are emerging from your day-to-day experience, because we asked you to be there. And so instead of asking for the students to give us, to engage in a feasibility study and making sure that they're asking their friends what they need and telling them to work just a little bit harder within their student organizations, and maybe then they'll feel like they belong. We took the burden on our shoulders and actualized some space for them. That's one example.
Yeah, I think the types of efforts that my colleagues described, are also happening here within the partnership of many different units and offices on campus, from my Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion team, who works very closely with our student communities, to our Student Life Office, which foresees a variety of affinity group organizations, including coalition organizations, as well as numbers of offices that work with community engaged work that is in support of and in partnership with Black communities. I think one of the things that you highlighted around intersectionality is so critical. So in the work of bringing students together in alliance, one is that racially and culturally there's intersectionality in terms of religious identity, gender identity, LGBTQ status, disability, and really getting trying to engage a discussion with our broader campus that all of these things are connected. We actually can't work on one type of ism at the same time because people occupy multiple identities, and so we can't silo people into their race or their gender or their disability and the like too, but we can actually enter things through different lenses that allow us to understand how racism, as it intersects with gender identity, may be creating conditions and structures and challenges as well. Another piece of the work that we're trying to do, which includes, naming anti-Blackness and naming that as a part of our anti-racism work, is pushing back against kind of what we call zero-sum thinking. That, a focus on a particular community with a particular set of efforts and energies does not come at the disadvantage of other groups. In our broader social political context right now, there's an investment in that zero-sum thinking to create distrust. And some of our institutions have unfortunately have earned that distrust historically as well. So we have to walk the walk in saying we can name anti-Blackness, we can name that as a part of our anti-racism work and work on it in a focused way as we also work to engage their interconnected identities and the many other identity groups that make up our campus. And the one thing I want to do is shout out our Black Student Union this year who came together and created a 4-point platform, which was really a call to kind of action, again, naming one of the biggest outcomes or one of the major areas of both progress and challenge in our strategic planning work in the last years. And in fact, our work since Proposition 2 was passed in 2006 that banned the consideration of race in admissions, a call for us to engage and make sure that we're investing in the most innovative approaches to recruit Black students and to retain them. Their call included addressing anti-Blackness on campus as it relates to cultures in classrooms, to the things that happen in peer and co-curricular spaces. They also pushed us to make sure that in our next DEI strategic plan phase, which is rolling out this fall, that we specifically name the specific considerations that we will attend to related to Black students, again, as we also engage in a broader effort to diversify our students. And then their fourth point in their platform was for us to, as a public institution, how are we engaging in K through 12 education to use our considerable resources to support the concerns and the issues of Black communities and to provide them more access. And so to Shauna's point around the work should not be only on students. And so we wanted to engage and we co-constructed a process. And I say we, meaning the president of our university, the provost, the vice provost for enrollment management, the vice president for student life, central leaders that oversee different spaces came together with the students to discuss a co-constructed approach where we wanted to have their perspective, lenses, and experiences, but we oversee structures with resources that could help support the implementation of and execution of the work. And this was really to the students, and we hear from them because their perspective on whether this working is the most important. Felt that this was a departure from other ways that the Central University administration had worked with them before, and that it really reflected this appropriate balance of Black students being agents of their own destiny and being experts on their own experience, but not putting the burden of institutional change on the students. And so I think more models like that, where we're working with students, but using our institutional structures and resources to serve them in this co-constructed way is useful. And then the last thing that I'll just mention, as a part of our anti-racism work on campus, we engaged in hiring a faculty with specific expertise in studying these issues and engaging these issues in practice, whether it was in the classroom or in their community engaged work in a variety of public spaces. And we think that is critically important because we know that students who have opportunities to engage with faculty from their own backgrounds actually show greater persistence and greater achievement on a variety of indices too. And again, it provides a space where we're combating anti-Blackness by showing students that their communities belong here, they're producers of knowledge, and that type of knowledge is critical to the important education that happens at this institution, and exposures to other faculty who don't do, Black faculty who don't do necessarily race-focused work, but signals that we belong in every discipline and field, and making this visible and investing resources and creating incentive structures for our schools and colleges to hire in this way. In ways that are legally permissible given the state of Michigan's legislative content. Talk about those if you're interested.
Thank you. And Dr. Patterson, when you were explaining on your campus how some students, maybe people outside, were calling the police on them, it really brought me back to my next question, which is like, it has especially become more clear and easily identifiable how our campuses are a microcosm of our society. And as CDOs, your campuses do look to you to lead DEI work to correct or help this. So what is it you see happening in our world that directly affects our students, faculty, and staff? And if you could center your answers around Black experiences, that would be helpful.
When I agreed to do this panel, one of the things that was emphasized was that we were going to engage in frank conversations about our lived experiences on these campuses, particularly as CDOs. So what I will say first is that folks on my campus understand that I will not be anybody's Obama. And what I mean by that is that I think it's amazing that Obama was our first Black president, right? And then everybody felt like he was going to be the one to fix it all, racially speaking. And I remember watching certain news outlets indicating, you know, they would interview folks and they felt like if it weren't for Obama, there wouldn't be racism, and that he's stirring the pot, and if it weren't for him, we'd be in a better place. And I understand that the things that we're contending with at Central Michigan University, within the state of Michigan, within the US, and in a global context, it was there before I got there. Hopefully it'll be chipped away at before I leave, but I'm not gonna fix it all. I'm no one's Obama. I'm not the cleanup woman, but I have a keen eye towards making sure that I'm thinking critically and strategically around making sure that, to the best of our abilities, we're upholding the basic understandings of what it means to provide folks with access to higher education. I can do that. You have to be able to hear what I have to say. And I'm not going to speak on behalf of anyone besides myself, because I only understand myself and my own lived experience, but I will make sure that I'm amplifying the voices of others or passing the mic. You know, I don't need to speak all the time. I can just make sure that the room is widening. I can make sure the doors are open. And so when I think about Black students in particular, I think that we are really great at thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in a way that's non-threatening in higher education. As long as I feel like I've checked off a box and I've gone to a training and I went to a Juneteenth event, then I'm good to go because I'm an ally and I'm showing up. And I think showing up does matter. I think being visible and present and engaged does matter. I am not diminishing that. But our Black students need us to be more than just a visible presence. Our Black students need to understand that they can actually depend on us to show up when it actually matters in the classroom, when we're developing legislation or pushing legislation, when we're engaging in hiring, when we're thinking about curriculum, when we're contending with what it means to stand on land that's stolen, but also worked by the hands of their ancestors. And our responsibility as higher education to think about the ways that the information available to us in this current moment and has been available to us over the centuries can actually be utilized in a way that fully and functionally engages Black communities to be self-empowered. So that's my personal opinion, but I do think that with some gusto and maybe a little bravery, some of our institutions of higher education can actually think strategically in ways that uplift Black communities in particular, especially in moments where some of them are excluding us from our own communities. Some of them are waiting for our schools to fail so they could build parking lots on those schools. I think we need to be thinking about engaging Black communities in ways that are authentic and true to what it means to build a coalition with Blackness in mind, and not in a way that feels comfortable always.
Do you guys have anything to add for maybe campuses and students? Is there anything to add for like what you see happening in our world that directly affects students, faculty, and staff on campuses like UM and MSU?
I'll just say that we must acknowledge that things that are happening around the world, around the country, around the state, and our local region does have an impact on not just our Black students, but Black people, if these are racially related events and incidents. And I think we can center Blackness and Black students by having Black students part of our conversations, telling us what it is they need, telling us what their experiences are in ways that we can help and support them. We're not putting the burden on them to do the work that we must do institutionally and to address systematically, but we do want the most informed information and advice to really help them where they are. The other thing is to acknowledge that these Black students are showing up Black in every space they go on our campus. So what are the things that we're doing to educate our colleagues about the social determinants of success? I'm in the medicine space, so and we often talk about the social determinants of health, but what are the social determinants of success? And a lot of that means being able to show up authentically who you are, all the dimensions, all the time. And for faculty and instructors and those who are engaging our students in the classroom to be able to acknowledge that sometimes we show up differently because of things that are happening on and around us. So I think that's really important.
I appreciate the comments of both of my colleagues and agree fully that these roles are should not be as a colleague said to me, like, Michigan took 200 years to get be how it is. One person's not going to come in and change it in a 5-year strategic plan. And so the idea of supporting students by creating structures, again, going back to structures and systems that serve them, along with the relational kinds of things that were described too. So I think about both of those things at the same time. How do we create nurturing communities for Black students? We've been engaging in more efforts to make sure that there are connections between Black students, staff, faculty, and alumni. Our students want to know them, and though in our communities of staff and faculty and alumni love our Black students and want to support them in coming through. And so creating structures, not just wanting that to happen, but creating regularized structures where that can happen. Another piece of the puzzle, I think, because Black students in our conversations with them, you're often feeling, particularly if you're looking at the enrollment numbers, the trends since Proposition 2 and the like, the anti-Blackness that's rampant societally and that shows up in their lived experience, they think, oh, people aren't working for them. And there are lots of things about how higher education systems work that are not visible. Like, you literally wouldn't know how things work unless you were in the administration and the like too. And we don't do a good job of making those systems and structures actually transparent to students. So, very frank conversations with students, and they were like, oh, we just thought the president or the chief diversity officer could just tell the faculty to act right. And I'm like, you know how much I wish that was true? Do you know how much I wish that was true? And I said, well, no. I said, but there's I said, influence is power as well. And so I talked with them about some of the incentive structures, some of the things that we'd set up to incentivize units to work on issues of race and anti-Blackness and anti-racism, and then said, like, if you actually see changes in your units, which some of them had, please know that somebody just didn't wake up and decide to be a nice person, that there were structures and pressures that were placed on them. And it's our job to do that, but to also let you know that we're doing it, because it's very deflating to feel like you're in a space where people don't see you, aren't working for you, and have forgotten about you. And so I think that, again, even though there is work to do to push and there is resistance, there is work that is being done by some of the communities of colleagues and collaborators that you described too, but we don't make that visible to students because they know that they're coming to places that are not perfect, with regard to race, but coming to a place that is imperfect, where you feel as though there are people who have your back and that there are people who are actively and continually working to change contexts, can be a part of a feeling of connection and belonging. And we can do a better job at supporting our Black students and understanding and having those understandings. But in showing and in discussing how things work, one of my joys and things I enjoy the most is also using that. Like, okay, now that you know how things work, it can help you be an activist in a more effective way. In fact, like, yes, please do call me and put this pressure on me for me to do X, because then I can engage with my leadership to say, I'm hearing from the community in these ways, or here are the people that oversee this area of decision making. And so your voice and knowing that can help them understand, like, systems work in ways. Actually, there's a lot of things that literally going to the president would not result in anything. In fact, he would call those other places. And if you know that, then it helps you feel more agentic. It helps you feel, again, that systems actually are more transparent and not this thing that's kind of working against you. And it also helps you think about what alliances to build. Again, not in a way that puts the work on the back of students, but the systems that are part of higher education also align with the kind of systems that they will encounter in their communities and in their workplaces and the like too. And so supporting them in this kind of systems thinking, not only will support, their engagement as students, but also them as change makers and citizens and in whatever spaces they enter. And that's a part of our responsibility that sometimes we fall down on because we're just not good in higher education about making transparent how things work, sometimes on purpose, so that things can work in the ways that they should not. So
a lot of what I hear is accessibility and transparency, which kind of goes, we have a question from the audience, and it kind of relates to that. How do you help minority students navigate the hidden curriculum to ensure that they have resources that they need and may not know is available to them?
specifically how they're navigating curriculum. Could you read the question again?
Yeah. How do you help minority students navigate the hidden curriculum to ensure that they have resources that they need and may not know is available to them?
I think some of the things that we discussed, both through our formal offices and also, in terms of creating structures where students can connect with faculty, staff, students, other peers to talk about these things. So even like advanced peers. So we have structures where we connect students with advanced peers who've gone through it to help support like the things that I wish I would have known and that you don't have to discover by accident because I've discovered them. One of my team members created a series, a new series called Real Talk, where I regularly will meet with students to just answer their questions about things. And we started with student leaders who've been involved, but to say, hey, we just want to talk about like what are the things that you wonder about. Oh, and also here are some things that we think are important to know that are not written down anywhere, and the like too. So I think that creating structures that are related, that support students and give them safe spaces to both ask questions that they might not feel that they can ask, but also understand that sometimes they don't even know the questions to ask because I wouldn't have known as an administrator how all kinds of things worked without that too. So I think, again, creating structures that are ongoing and regularized that allow students to have those kinds of opportunities.
And I'll just add one thing and say that our advanced peers, as I heard you say, Tabby, look out for our incoming students. So for years, but I don't know if this produced annually, Black students have produced like a Black guide to MSU. So I think it lists like the places to go or not to go, you know, the dining halls to eat in, the residence halls to try to stay in, those types of things. So that has helped students navigate as well. And it's that feeling, a sense of community that Black students feel and have for each other despite the states or the parts of this state they come from, or even the countries often, they do find community often because they feel like they have to or they need to. With our institution like Michigan, CMU being so large, we can have students in certain majors or residence halls who find themselves being the only one like themselves. So it's really important for us to provide space and to support community building, but also for themselves to, again, engage in community in the ways that they see fit.
And I think in addition to thinking about like those one-on-one or intimate conversations in the office, a structured offering that we are actually devising at the start of September is an actual summit. And it will go into detail of not just the written down logistical nuts and bolts of what it means to be a student leader on campus. We're also thinking about the things that are not written down, how they can go about engaging in trying to move forward some of the pieces that are really necessary to changing their material lived experience. And the other piece on that is there's a recognition that, yes, we have student leaders that take on executive board positions, but we're inviting anybody that would be interested in being in that space. Because we also noticed that there are students that may have those same experiences that are not necessarily connected or tied to any kind of entity. And so the best way I could think to attend to their needs as well, or to be in connectivity with them, is just to invite everybody. And so that's one of the ways that we're trying to breach some of those gaps as well.
And for another audience question, in what ways would you like to see more celebration of Blackness at your institutions?
My quick response is the most appropriate, meaning doing things that really do celebrate the Black experience, but truly commemorate and acknowledge the history. Acknowledging the history of slavery, acknowledging why Juneteenth is even being celebrated, and acknowledging that we still have a ways to go. I think that's the most important way and the most respectful way to do it.
I think these types of celebrations are critical in affirming our communities. But I also, the things that we're trying to do around structures and systems, I guess my greater aspiration is that students feel as though they can celebrate themselves all the time. I just, one of the most striking findings from one of my research studies, or one of many, we were talking to students about, to Black students about racial discrimination, campus and students, in spaces on campus. And so, my graduate students were interviewing Black undergraduates across our institutions, including students from your institution, as a part of the study. And students said things like, well, I remember one of my students was interviewing a student who said, like, oh, well, a Black man who said, I don't experience that much discrimination. And of course, my student, we're taught that their lived experience is theirs, but they were probes like, tell me more about what that means. What spaces do you feel you connect with and belong in? And the student proceeded to talk about, well, I don't experience that much discrimination because I just don't go to these certain spaces anymore. I don't go in this building. I don't go in this building. I don't go in this building. And that's a really self-protective, agentic response. But there are things in that building that you need probably to support you educationally, socially, and to feel that the full campus is not yours, that you cannot be yourself in a space without being over-monitored or hyper-visible or invisible in some cases, is a shame, and it's something that is an institutional shame, not a shame for the student. And so when we think about the work that we're doing to support students and to address anti-Blackness, it's about making sure that our students feel as though, they can be celebrated every day, that all spaces are their spaces, and that they're not particular spaces where who they are and all of their identities is not valued or is, not only not valued, but marginalized or stigmatized or excluded in ways that cause real harm.
I think the thing I'll add, I am a Detroiter from the West Side. That's my lived experience. So growing up and going to school, I was surrounded by people like myself. It was a beautiful thing. I didn't know that not everyone had that experience in the US. And so when I think about Mount Pleasant, I invite every one of you to come visit me. Come to Mount Pleasant, Michigan, please. We will welcome you. I think about not just the campus itself, but I think about what it means to live in Mount Pleasant as a Black person. And within the scope of the law, I would love for Central Michigan University to best reflect the state's population. I also would love for it to reflect the population on campus within the state as well. So, an example, I was having lunch with a student, was begging her to not consider transferring, and I said, how's it going? What's going on? And she said, I gotta go. Well, why? I can't believe it. What would possess you to want to leave this place? And she said, I just need a Coney Island. Yes, chili cheese fry me, please. I appreciate the nature and the beauty of the nature in Mount Pleasant. I appreciate all the potential of Mount Pleasant, Michigan. I did go to Michigan State, but I'm also an alum of Central Michigan University, so I'm not averse to what she's talking about. I know exactly what she's saying. And so in addition to thinking about offering programmatic activities and curricula that best reflect the diaspora, I also would hope that we could maybe think about building bridges in our community to also reflect the various types of communities that are represented at Central Michigan University in Mount Pleasant. And also tie better our connectivity with the Saginaw Chippewa Indian tribe that is a neighboring nation for us. So I would love to see some of that actualized in the Mount Pleasant area as well, just so folks feel like, oh, yeah, CMU has me, and when I walk across the street, I'm okay there too. That's something I'd like to see.
And for another question from the audience, how do we make systemic changes when bound by policy outside our control, specifically free speech lawsuit policy and the challenges of holding individuals accountable for harm when it is protected by free speech? And I can repeat it again if you'd like. How do we make systemic changes when bound by policy outside our control, specifically free speech lawsuit policy and the changes of holding individuals accountable for harm when it is protected by free speech?
This is the space that we're in. So I would say I will not have a clean, crystallized solution there. But I think one of the areas, and this is, I guess, a huge issue on our campus and many campuses across the country, and one of the things that has been a part of this insidious strategy to push against DEI is to pit it against free speech and freedom of expression in ways that lead to this view that free speech principles are just for protecting people who can say racist and harmful things. This is an area where I want to push back against that one, there's a history of free speech principles and academic freedom policies that were intended to protect those who had marginalized viewpoints and the like too. So again, going back to the value of history, so that understanding that history is a part of many communities like ours, like our Black community, that where it have been historically marginalized, free speech is supposed to protect our speech as much as it's supposed to protect the speech of a white supremacist and the like too. And here is how you can use that speech, even in response to that other speech, in strategic ways, and not just have it on you, but here's how your institution can use its free speech in response to free speech. Because yes, free speech allows for the white supremacist to name a perspective, but we also have free speech in saying that although that person has the right to say X, we don't claim it. We push back against it, and here are the policies and practices that we have in place that prevent people from behaving based on particular beliefs that we know from research have undermined people's ability to be successful, have disadvantaged them from having equitable opportunity and access to. So I think we have to thread that needle in ways that right now it's being oversimplified. It's DEI or free speech, and they need to be together. In fact, if we actually are engaging the diverse communities and all their intersectionalities in the ways that we want, we actually should have different ways of thinking about the world. We actually should have, things that might be contradictory worldviews. That is not the same as policies and practices and norms of behavior and engagement in the workplace and in the classroom that allow people to not have the same work or learning opportunity, and that we can name the ways that our policies signal the kinds of behaviors and the kinds of interactions that we expect and that we do not expect. So right now we're in this space where it's kind of DEI or free speech, and I know a lot of folks on our campus are doing some important thought work to battle that, because when that plays out that way, our students, and in this case our Black students, are the ones who suffer.
Quickly, I'll just say we also must specifically look at policies, as we heard Tabby say, around anti-discrimination, look at our policies around civility and retaliation as well, to again sort of guard against bad behavior. And I think articulating our institutional values, and we just did this for the first time a couple years ago through our strategic planning process, is really key, because we can point to those and hold people accountable if we choose to behaviors associated with those values. So there are ways that we can work to guard against bad actors and their behavior, as well as just, again, helping the entire campus understand what free speech is, what its limitations are, and for our first-year students who are coming in who will have questions based on challenges they face every year. So there has to be education, but also ensuring our policies are in place, communicated, and enforced.
And I think also utilizing a data-driven approach to trying to highlight the ways that some harmful speech that is free speech has tabulated over time to create a harmful environment. So leaning into legislation like Title IX to utilize that as the embedded piece around why this particular speech was harmful in these ways that impact our codes of conduct, that impact our policies, our practices. These are the ways that this went from free speech to harm. I think being able to utilize data and utilize narrative to build that connectivity also it lends itself to helping folks understand the limitations, but also the breadth that we have with regard to being an institution that holds people accountable to creating instances of harm on campus.
Thank you. And we are approaching our final question, also from the audience. In light of the fact that Dr. King was assassinated while supporting striking workers, how can UM justify its disengagement from the GEO strike, many of whose leaders are students of color?
One, because, well, I guess I would say, and and this is where I will value the free speech of many. That I think there is a lot of engagement between the university administrative leadership and the striking students. There is a tension, and this is an unprecedented tension, in that our strike process has the longest one that we've encountered as an institution. I will say that There are particular debates and tensions around the specific demands of the GEO. And some of them are related to kind of labor policies and structures around kind of pay and kind of how the pay that is being asked for is in parity with other forms of pay for other personnel, because the strike is about students while they're in teaching employee roles. But I will say there's a lot of energy, including but beyond the GEO specific debates or negotiations about what resources do we have in place to support students with vulnerabilities? Because we do know that graduate education has changed. You know, graduate education was not set up for the non-privileged. And so we do know that our population of graduate students, you know, those who have families, those who are supporting dependents, those who are not kind of have independent kind of resources or wealth, you know, more are coming into play. And what are we doing with our financial aid structures to support students who are coming in with those different types of situations? I think what the students in GEO are asking, and you know, like I'm going beyond, would probably I'm not unauthorized to say anything, but I think the students are using the negotiation process about teaching positions to raise a broader issue about access in graduate education. So I really have an appreciation for the idea of, are we setting up graduate education in a way that makes it accessible and inclusive, which I view as slightly different from the specifics of the negotiations around employees, you know, because the GEO is about graduate students when they're in teaching positions. So the same graduate students when they're not in teaching positions are not a part of the union. I think, so that's where the tension is. I think there's a mechanism around teaching positions that is being used to really push the university to think more broadly about the cost of graduate education. And I think that's where the stickiness lies. I will say that one of the things that I learned as a part of the process is that, you know, we do provide, you know, about over $170 million a year in financial aid for our graduate students, and I think that is not known across. And I think, you know, one question that I had when learning that is, you know, are students aware of this, and how is it deployed in ways that actually help us address the students who have the most financial challenge and vulnerability? So that's a long and not crystallized answer to that, because we haven't come to resolution in the negotiations between the university and the GEO. But I can say there are a lot of people in our offices who are thinking about issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion for our graduate students, including those that are disproportionately experienced by students of color.
Thank you. And that is the end of our panel. So thank you to the audience for engaging with us, and thank you to the panelists for bearing with me and my question.
Give the panelists another round of applause. So, many thanks and much appreciation to Dr. Bennett, Dr. Patterson-Stevens, and Dr. Chavis for their candor and for such an engaging and thoughtful discussion this morning to kick off the Juneteenth activities here. Also, a big round of applause to Sloan Campbell for serving as our moderator and doing such a phenomenal job here today. I've been tasked with providing a summary of some things that I heard, but there's people who are far smarter than me here to do that, and there were so many thoughtful things I would share, but I'll try to take a quick stab at it. I heard things related to systems and systems theory, thanks to Dr. Patterson-Stevens for introducing that, and the idea of focusing on systems instead of individuals, as Dr. Chavis included that note. Also, I heard things related to the necessity for being transparent around policy so that all within the system can can better understand how things function within these spaces. And then lastly, there, as it relates to systems and systems theory, there was a piece that Dr. Chavis mentioned, and also Dr. Bennett, related to higher end practices and other systems within systems. But this idea of assessing and deconstructing systems and connecting inequitable policies and practices to eliminate and ultimately remove those inequities. And I think that's something that is important, an important takeaway. There was also a lot related to racialization and also the social construction of race, particularly at the beginning of the panel, and the effective practices on folks, the effective properties on folks within the system, those who are disenfranchised, but also those who are empowered by it. And so I think those are things that we can be mindful of how racialization impacts us all within in these spaces. And then there was a lot of conversation about the importance of engagement and sustained dialogue, as introduced by Dr. Bennett. And he went on to discuss the notions of being accessible and providing support and resources, with Dr. Chavis adding on those resources being tangible and instrumental, which I think is important to note. And Dr. Patterson also added on there being responsive to students, which I think is critically important takeaway within this space, and being inclusive of the students and treating them as collaborators and actors in as much as we are as faculty, staff here within the university, or universities, I should say, and not to sort of burden them with this work. And then towards the end, I heard some notes around understanding and creating spaces that affirm the experiences of Black students in this space. All of the panelists touched on that, and again, as a sort of Black male who's navigated these spaces, I appreciate that sort of thought. And then lastly, Dr. Patterson Stephen, apologies, opened with a note about the importance of being data informed in our work, and also closed out on that. And so this idea of engaging and assessing data to understand experiences and outcomes, while also using it to inform the reconstruction of policies and practices moving forward. So those are a few of my takeaways. I'm sure that you all had others here this afternoon. And again, I would like to thank the panelists, and then thank you all for being engaged, an engaged audience, and for the thoughtful questions and energy that you all brought this morning. There are some other great sessions planned over the next 2 days. And in fact, there are 2 wonderful breakout sessions happening here this morning. One beginning at 10:30, where there will be a panel on understanding and addressing the impact of housing discrimination on the Black community. And then after that, there will be another panel discussion on fighting the voter suppression crisis within America. And so again, thank you all for your participation, and to the panelists and to all the other participants here today. Take good care.
My